Julian Croft was the kind of man who could buy anything: forgiveness. He thought burying Montana under glass and steel would make the pain disappear. But when his teenage son vanished into the wilderness, angry, alone, and grieving the mother they both failed to mourn, Julian realized just how useless power is when the thing you love most is lost. The blizzard was closing in, search teams were stalling, and the only lead came from something Julian had dismissed as a myth. A bison, Orion, twice the size of any man. Grieving, furious, caged. Locals said his cries could break your soul. But that night, Orion did something no one expected. He escaped, not to rage, but to lead. Now the creature Julian once called a liability may be the only thing keeping his son alive. And this time, Julian has to follow him. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The cold Montana air in Julian Croft's sterile, glass-walled mansion felt as thin and unforgiving as the atmosphere on a distant planet. At 48, he had conquered the world of technology, amassing a fortune so vast it had become an abstraction. A string of zeros on a screen that had long ago lost its connection to tangible reality. He had everything a man could want and nothing that he needed. His life was a silent testament to the hollowing nature of loss, a grief so profound it had calcified his heart. 3 years ago, he had lost his wife Elena to a sudden illness. And in the silent, echoing months that followed, he had lost his son. Leo, now 17, was not gone from the world, but he was gone from Julian's, the chasm between them carved out by unspoken grief and Julian's cold, pragmatic retreat into the only thing he still knew how to control: his business empire. The latest battle had been the worst yet. It had been about the land, this vast, wild expanse of Montana that Julian was systematically acquiring for his magnum opus, the Elysium Project, a sprawling state-of-the-art tech campus that would be his legacy. Leo, who had inherited his mother's fierce love for the natural world, saw the project not as progress, but as a desecration. "She would have hated this," Leo had shouted, his voice cracking with the turbulent emotions of a teenager who felt utterly alone. "You're burying everything she loved under glass and steel, just like you buried everything else." The words had struck Julian with the force of a physical blow, precisely because they were true. And Julian, incapable of expressing the pain, had retaliated with the only tool he had left: cold, cutting authority. An hour later, Leo was gone, his pickup truck tearing down the long gravel driveway, kicking up a cloud of dust that settled like a shroud over Julian's perfect manicured lawn. The only obstacle remaining to the Elysium Project was a small, chronically underfunded animal sanctuary that sat on a crucial 50-acre parcel of land. It was run by a fiercely dedicated veterinarian named Dr. Aris Thorne, who had stubbornly refused every one of Julian's increasingly generous offers. Her sanctuary was home to the broken and the discarded, but its most famous resident was a creature that had become a local legend of sorrow and rage. His name was Orion, a full-grown American bison of breathtaking size and power. He was kept in a specially reinforced enclosure, a cage of steel and concrete, because his grief had made him dangerously unpredictable. A year earlier, a summer, wildfire had swept through the national forest, trapping Orion and his small family. He had survived, but his mate and their young calf had not. Since then, Orion had been consumed by a grief so profound it manifested as a constant simmering fury. He would charge the walls of his cage at the slightest provocation, and at night his bellows would echo across the valley deep, mournful cries that sounded so much like human weeping that tourists would stop their cars on the highway, listening in stunned, heartbroken silence. Julian had seen the bison once, dismissing him as a dangerous liability that needed to be managed. He saw the animal's grief not with empathy, but with the detached irritation of a man who refused to acknowledge his own. Now, as the afternoon sky began to darken with the unmistakable signs of an early, vicious snowstorm, Julian received a call that made his own carefully constructed world shatter. It was the local sheriff. Leo's truck had been found abandoned at a trailhead 20 miles deep into the wilderness, an area that bordered the sanctuary and Julian's own vast, undeveloped property. A massive search and rescue operation was underway, but the blizzard was moving in fast, threatening to halt all efforts and turn a search for a lost boy into a recovery mission. The world's most powerful man was suddenly terrifyingly powerless. The command post was set up in the main barn of Dr. Thorne's sanctuary, the only defensible location against the storm. Julian stood amidst the frantic energy of the rescue teams, the crackle of radios, and the worried faces of the volunteers, feeling a cold, paralyzing terror he hadn't known since the day his wife died. His wealth, his influence, his power, all meant nothing against the howling wind and the indifferent cruelty of the coming storm. It was then that he heard it. Over the shriek of the wind, he heard the sound that had become the sanctuary's heartbeat of sorrow, Orion's deep, weeping bellows. The sound cut through Julian's terror and pierced the armor around his heart. For the first time, he didn't hear an angry animal. He heard a perfect, devastating echo of the grief that was lodged in his own throat. He saw a father who had lost his family, crying out into a world that would not answer. In that moment, logic abandoned him. All the pragmatism and control that had built his empire dissolved into a single, desperate, irrational impulse. He walked out of the command post and into the driving snow, making his way directly to Orion's cage. Dr. Thorne saw him and shouted, "Mr. Croft, get back inside." "It's not safe," but Julian didn't hear her. He reached the cage and stood before the magnificent, grieving animal. Orion stopped his pacing and stared at him, his dark eyes like pools of liquid night, reflecting the swirling snow and Julian's own bottomless despair. "They say you lost your family," Julian said, his voice raw, shouting to be heard over the storm. "I'm about to lose mine. My son, my boy is out there, you understand. You know what that feels like." He fumbled with the heavy, industrial latch on the cage door, his numb fingers struggling with the frozen metal. Anya and several rescue workers ran toward him, yelling for him to stop. It was an act of pure madness, releasing a 2,000-pound, traumatized animal into the middle of a chaotic emergency situation. But Julian wasn't thinking. He was acting from a place of shared, primal pain. With a final desperate heave, the lock gave way. Julian swung the heavy steel door open. He had just freed the crying bison from his cage. Orion stood motionless for a long moment, the open door a silent invitation to a freedom he hadn't known in a year. Then he looked at Julian, a long, intelligent gaze that seemed to penetrate the billionaire's soul. And what the bull did next would leave everyone shocked. Have you ever been so desperate that you placed your faith in something that defied all logic? Do you believe that animals can understand the depth of human grief and respond with an intelligence we can't explain? The moment the cage door swung open, a collective gasp was sucked from the lungs of everyone who witnessed it. Dr. Arise Thorne felt her blood run cold, her mind instantly cataloging the catastrophic possibilities. A panicked, 2,000-pound animal charging through the command post, injuring rescuers, destroying the equipment. She expected a maelstrom of chaos and violence. But the maelstrom never came. Orion took one step out of the enclosure, then another, his movements not frantic or explosive, but deliberate and strangely calm. He stood in the swirling snow, his massive form a dark silhouette against the whiteout conditions, and turned his head. He looked directly at Julian Croft, holding his gaze for a long, unblinking moment. It was not a look of aggression or fear. It was, Arise thought with a sense of utter disbelief, a look of acknowledgement, of understanding. Then, the great bison turned his body away from the chaos of the barn and the rescue teams, and faced the howling wilderness to the north, the very direction Leo had vanished. He let out a single deep bellow, but this one was different from his cries of grief. It was a call of purpose, a sound that seemed to slice through the storm's fury. And then he began to walk, his powerful legs carrying him into the teeth of the blizzard with an unshakable resolve. He was not fleeing, he was heading somewhere. "He's going after him," Julian breathed, the words a mixture of terror and dawning, impossible hope. He turned to the nearest rescue worker. "Give me a snowmobile, now." "Sir, that's insane," the rescue captain argued, stepping forward. "We're about to call our teams back. Visibility is near zero, and the temperature is dropping into the single digits. Going out there now is a suicide mission. We can't authorize it." "I'm not asking for your authorization," Julian said, his voice a low, dangerous command. The cold, ruthless authority that had built his empire was back, but now it was fueled by a father's desperate love. "That animal is the only thing on this planet that has a chance of finding my son. I am not letting him go alone." Aris, her scientific mind reeling, made a split-second decision that went against every protocol she had ever known. "He's right," she said, her voice cutting through the captain's protests. "That bison's senses are 1,000 times more acute than ours. He can navigate this weather by scent and sound in a way our GPS systems can't. If there's any chance, it's with him." She turned to her own small team at the sanctuary. "Get our own ATV. We're going too. We'll track them from a safe distance." The journey that followed was a surreal and terrifying odyssey. Julian, on a high-powered snowmobile, followed the dark, moving shape of the bison, a beacon of life in a world of swirling white. He pushed the machine to its limits, the engine screaming in protest against the biting cold and the deepening snow. He had no map, no compass, only a desperate, unshakable faith in the grieving animal ahead of him. Aris and a seasoned rescuer named Mike followed a few hundred yards behind, their own vehicle's headlights barely penetrating the gloom. They used a thermal scope, a strange, high-tech counterpoint to the primal scene unfolding before them. Through the scope, they could see two heat signatures, the massive, steady glow of the bison and the smaller engine-hot signature of Julian's snowmobile. "This is unprecedented," Aris said, her voice a hushed whisper of awe as she recorded notes into a handheld device. "The animal is not just moving randomly. Look at his path. He's navigating the terrain, avoiding the deepest snowdrifts, following the contours of the land. He's not just surviving this storm, he's mastering it." They traveled for what felt like an eternity, pushing deeper into the wilderness, miles beyond where the official search had been called off. The storm intensified, the wind a physical wall that threatened to stop them in their tracks. Several times, Julian lost sight of Orion in the whiteout, his heart seizing with panic, only for the massive form to reappear, a ghost of purpose in the blizzard, still moving forward. It was Orion's behavior that was most remarkable. He would pause every few minutes, lifting his great head, his nostrils flaring as he tasted the air. He would turn his head, his ears swiveling like radar dishes, listening for something only he could hear. He was actively tracking, using a sensory toolkit that made human technology seem laughably primitive. Julian felt the hope in his chest. Warring with a growing despair, they had been out for hours. Leo couldn't possibly survive this long. The cold was seeping into Julian's own bones, despite his state-of-the-art gear. He was on the verge of giving up, of surrendering to the crushing grief that was now mixed with the freezing cold when Orion stopped. They were in a small, sheltered valley, surrounded by a thick grove of ancient pine trees that offered some protection from the wind. Orion stood at the base of a rocky outcropping, a dark cliff face that was barely visible through the snow. He turned his head and looked back directly at Julian's snowmobile, then let out another deep, resonant call. It was a call of discovery. Julian killed the engine, the sudden silence deafening. He stumbled off the machine, his legs numb, and plunged through the waist-deep snow toward the bison. Aris and Mike pulled up moments later, their faces grim. They all knew this could be the end of the line, the place where they found the worst. Orion stood before a narrow fissure in the rock face, an opening almost completely obscured by a snowdrift. He nudged the snow away with his head, clearing the entrance to a small, shallow cave. And from within that cave, they heard a faint, weak sound. A human voice. "Dad?" Julian's heart stopped. He fell to his knees and scrambled into the opening, and there, huddled in the back of the cave, was his son. Leo was pale, shivering violently, and his ankle was clearly injured, but he was alive. But it was the scene itself that defied all comprehension. Leo was not alone in the cave. The ground around him was melted clear of snow in a wide circle, and the air within the small space was noticeably warmer. The reason was Orion. The tracks in the snow were unmistakable. The bison had not just led them here. He had been here before. He had found Leo hours earlier, led him to the shelter of the cave, and then, in an act of breathtaking intelligence and empathy, had stood guard at the entrance, his massive body blocking the wind, his own body heat creating a pocket of warmth that had kept his son from freezing to death. He had then left his charge, gone back out into the storm, and found the one person who could complete the rescue. He found me," Leo whispered, his teeth chattering as Julian wrapped him in emergency blankets. "I fell. Hurt my ankle. He just appeared, pushed me this way. He stayed. Kept me warm." Aris knelt at the entrance, her thermal scope now pointed at the interior of the cave. The data was irrefutable. The ambient temperature inside the small shelter was nearly 15 degrees warmer than the outside air. "It's impossible," she breathed, the words forming puffs of condensation in the frigid air. He performed a multi-stage, intelligent rescue. He located the subject, moved him to a secure location, provided environmental support, and then went for help. That's not instinct, that's cognition. It's empathy. Outside the cave, Orion stood quietly in the snow, his duty done. He looked at Julian, who was now holding his sobbing, shivering son. And in the bison's dark, ancient eyes, Julian saw not an animal, but a savior, a fellow father who had crossed the boundaries of species to save a child. The billionaire who had lost everything had just gotten it all back, thanks to the miraculous intervention of a creature whose grief he had, for one brief, desperate moment, finally understood. If you have ever been moved by the incredible, unexplainable actions of an animal, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Stories like this remind us that the capacity for heroism and love exists in the most unexpected corners of our world. What do you think this incredible act says about the consciousness of animals? The rescue of Leo Croft was the beginning of a legend, a story that rippled out from the snow-covered Montana wilderness to capture the imagination of the world. But for Julian, Aris, and Leo, it was the beginning of something far more profound. A slow, difficult, and beautiful process of healing. Back in the warmth and safety of the sanctuary's main building, as Leo was being treated for severe hypothermia and a fractured ankle, the full weight of what had happened began to settle in. Julian sat by his son's side, holding his hand, unable to speak, the years of cold distance between them melting away in a silent flood of gratitude and relief. The story, as pieced together from Leo's fragmented account, was even more miraculous than they had imagined. Orion had found him not long after he had fallen and injured himself. The bison had approached not with aggression, but with a strange, calm purpose, nudging him, guiding him toward the shelter of the cave. For hours, the great animal had stood as a living wall against the blizzard's fury, his deep, rumbling breaths a comforting presence in the terrifying darkness. "I thought I was hallucinating," Leo later told Dr. Thorne, his voice still weak, but he was so calm. He just looked at me, and I felt safe, like he knew I was a kid, and I was hurt. Dr. Thorne meticulously documented every detail, her scientific mind grappling with the implications. What Leo is describing is an act of deliberate, cross-species altruism, she explained to us stunned. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Sheriff and rescue team. Orion assessed a situation, identified a vulnerable being from another species, and took complex, sustained action to protect it, all at great personal risk. There is no existing behavioral model that fully explains this. He didn't just save a life, he rewrote the rules. The media frenzy was immediate and intense. The tale of the billionaire's bison was irresistible. But Julian, in his first act as a changed man, took complete control of the narrative. He gave one single exclusive interview, and he used it not to glorify himself, but to honor the animal that had saved his son. He spoke of Orion's grief, of the shared pain that had prompted him to open the cage, and of the profound intelligence the bison had displayed. He announced that the Elysium project was canceled, effective immediately. The news sent shockwaves through the business world, but Julian was resolute. He had spent his life building a legacy of glass and steel, and he had almost lost his son. Now he would build a legacy of something else entirely. In the weeks that followed, as Leo recovered, he and Julian began to talk for the first time in years. They talked about Alina, sharing memories they had both locked away. They talked about the land, and Julian finally listened as Leo described the life in the forests and rivers that he had only seen as lines on a blueprint. The healing between father and son was slow and awkward, but it was real, built on the shared foundation of a miracle. Julian's next move was even more shocking than canceling his project. He approached Dr. Thorne with a proposal. He wanted to use his personal fortune to not only secure the future of her struggling sanctuary, but to expand it. He envisioned a massive multi-million-acre wilderness preserve, a place where animals like Orion could live freely, and where a new kind of research could take place, research focused not on exploiting nature, but on understanding its deep, hidden consciousness. He wanted to fund it, to build it, and he wanted to name it after the creature that had given him his family back. The Orion Preserve was born. It became the largest privately funded conservation effort in North American history. Dr. Thorne was appointed its director, given a virtually unlimited budget, to create a world-class center for the study of animal cognition and interspecies communication. The story of Orion's rescue became the facility's founding principle, that animals possess an emotional and intellectual depth that humanity is only beginning to comprehend. Orion himself became the preserve's living heart. Freed from his cage, he roamed the vast protected lands, the patriarch of a new herd that was slowly reintroduced to the valley. He was no longer the crying bison, defined by his rage and grief. He was a symbol of resilience, wisdom, and the healing power of connection. He would often be seen standing on a high ridge, watching over his new family, his presence a calm, steadying force. Julian and Leo became regular fixtures at the preserve. The cold, sterile mansion was sold, replaced by a modest, sustainable home built on the edge of the protected land. They worked alongside Orise and her team, their shared purpose cementing the bond that Orion had forged in the heart of the blizzard. Julian found a joy in contributing to something living and wild that all his billions had never been able to buy. Leo, planning to follow in Orise's footsteps and study veterinary science, had found his path. One clear autumn afternoon, a year after the rescue, Julian and Leo stood with Orise on a hillside, watching Orion graze with his herd in the valley below. The bison was a magnificent sight, the very picture of peace and strength. He taught me something, Julian said quietly, his eyes on the great bull. I spent my whole life believing that power was about control, about bending the world to your will. Orion taught me that true power is about connection, about the willingness to open the cage door, for yourself and for others." Leo nodded, a comfortable silence passing between him and his father. He knew exactly what his father meant. The bison hadn't just saved his life. He had saved their family. As they watched, Orion lifted his head and looked up the hill, his gaze seeming to meet theirs across the vast distance. He let out a deep, contented rumble, a sound that was no longer a cry of grief, but a song of peace, a sound that echoed the healed and hopeful rhythm of all their hearts. The billionaire who had sought to conquer the wilderness had instead been conquered by its wisdom, and in surrendering, he had finally truly come home. What do you think this story teaches us about the nature of power and the definition of a meaningful legacy? Can one profound experience truly change the core of who a person is? The 5 years that followed the blizzard were a study in quiet, powerful growth. The Orion Preserve, once a billionaire's abandoned blueprint, had become a vibrant, living ecosystem and a global center for a new kind of science, one rooted in respect and observation rather than control and exploitation. Julian Croft, the man who once sought to pave paradise, was now its most dedicated gardener. He had traded boardrooms for windswept ridges, stock reports for migration patterns. The transformation was total. The cold, sterile grief that had encased his heart for years had thawed, replaced by a quiet joy he found in the daily rhythms of the preserve and in the restored, easy affection of his son. Leo, now 22, was on the cusp of becoming Dr. Croft himself. He was in his final year of veterinary school, completing his residency under the mentorship of Dr. Aris Thorne. He had his mother's empathy and his father's sharp intellect, a combination that made him a uniquely gifted student of the wild. The bond forged with his father in the heart of that long-ago storm had become the bedrock of his life, a steady, unshakable foundation. And at the center of their world was Orion, the great bison, now well into his twilight years, was the undisputed patriarch of the valley. He was a living legend, his story told to every visitor, his presence a constant reminder of the preserve's founding miracle. He led his thriving herd with a calm, ancient wisdom, his massive, scarred head a symbol of a grief that had been transformed not into a memory of pain, but into a wellspring of profound peace. The preserve was a paradise, but even paradise is not immune to the subtle, creeping tendrils of decay. The trouble began quietly, almost imperceptibly. It started with the deer. A game camera in the southern sector captured footage of a white-tailed buck acting erratically, walking in tight circles, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. A week later, a hiker on a designated trail reported an encounter with an elk cow that had shown no fear, approaching the human with a strange, glassy-eyed stupor before stumbling away into the forest. Aris and her growing team of scientists were immediately concerned. The behaviors were classic signs of a neurological disorder, and in this part of the world, that usually meant one thing: chronic wasting disease, or CWD, a prion disease. CWD was a highly infectious and universally fatal affliction that could spread like a phantom plague through deer and elk populations, turning entire ecosystems into dead zones. It was, for a place like the Orion Preserve, a potential apocalypse. The atmosphere at the research center, once buzzing with the excitement of discovery, grew heavy with a quiet dread. Leo was assigned to lead the initial fieldwork, a grim task. That involved tracking and sedating the afflicted animals to collect brain and spinal fluid samples for testing. He spent his days in the deep woods, his heart aching as he witnessed the disease's cruel progression. The beautiful, graceful creatures of the forest were being robbed of their very essence. Their wild instincts scrambled into a confused, pathetic dance of death. "The preliminary tests are back," Aris announced one evening, her face grim as she addressed Julian and the senior staff. It's inconclusive. It presents like CWD, but the specific prion markers aren't showing up. We're dealing with something else, something we haven't seen before. The news was both a relief and a new source of terror. It might not be CWD, but an unknown pathogen could be even worse. As the weeks turned into a month, the mysterious affliction spread. The number of disoriented animals grew, and a new, more dangerous symptom began to appear: aggression. A normally placid bull elk charged a research vehicle, smashing a headlight. Before staggering away, the preserve was forced to close its hiking trails, the silent, creeping sickness casting a dark shadow over the once peaceful valley. Amidst the growing crisis, a new challenge arrived at their gates. It came in a reinforced steel trailer from a federal facility in Idaho, a living embodiment of trauma so severe that even a Reese was hesitant. His name was Ghost, a massive gray wolf, the former alpha of a pack that had been captured and forced into an illegal dogfighting ring. Ghost was the sole survivor, rescued during a brutal raid, but the creature that had been saved was little more than a vessel of pure, indiscriminate rage. He was deemed irredeemably violent, a lost cause. Most sanctuaries had refused him, but the Orion Preserve's mission was to take in the hopeless. Ghost was introduced into a specially built high-security enclosure, a remote 5-acre pen of reinforced steel mesh and deep concrete footings, miles from the public areas and the main bison herd. He was a whirlwind of fury, a gray specter of snarling teeth and haunted yellow eyes. He charged the fences at the sight of any human, threw himself against the steel with a suicidal ferocity, and refused all attempts at positive conditioning. He was, in every way, a perfect mirror of what Orion had once been, but without the underlying grief that had been the key to his healing. Leo, as part of his behavioral residency, was assigned the frustrating and often terrifying task of observing Ghost. He would spend hours sitting in a fortified blind, watching the wolf pace the fence line in a relentless neurotic pattern, a physical manifestation of a mind that knew no peace. Leo felt a strange, conflicted empathy for the creature. He saw the deep, shattering trauma beneath the violence, but he could find no way in. Ghost was a fortress of pain, and every overture of help was met with the snarl and the sharp, metallic clang of his body hitting the fence. The two mysteries of the preserve, the creeping sickness and the untamable wolf, seemed to consume all their energy. But Julian, watching his son's growing frustration with the wolf, was reminded of the lesson Orion had taught him years ago. "We're focusing on the problems," he said to Reese and Leo one evening. "Maybe we should be focusing on the solution. What is Orion doing? How is he handling this?" The question shifted their perspective. They began to divert resources to observing the bison herd with a new intensity. And they quickly discovered something extraordinary. The sickness that was ravaging the deer and elk had not touched a single bison. In fact, Orion was actively leading his herd in a complex pattern of avoidance. Analysis of their GPS collar data showed that the bison were deliberately staying away from the areas where the sick animals were most frequently sighted. More than that, Orion was leading them on strange, new grazing routes, always keeping the herd upwind from the sick zones. He was navigating his family around the invisible plague with a prescient, almost mystical awareness. "He knows where the danger is," Leo said in amazement, pointing to the overlapping maps on the screen. "He's creating a moving quarantine. But how? How does he know?" Reese was equally baffled. "It suggests he can sense the sickness in the environment, perhaps through scent cues we can't even detect. He's not just reacting. He's proactively protecting his herd with a long-term strategy. It's a level of environmental cognition that is simply remarkable." They were witnessing indigenous animal knowledge in action, a wisdom that was far outpacing their own scientific methods. But even as they marveled at Orion's intelligence, a new crisis was brewing. one that would force the two mysteries of the preserve to collide with catastrophic force. A late-season thunderstorm, the kind that rips through the mountains with sudden, explosive violence, rolled in one afternoon. It was a storm of biblical proportions, with torrential rain and lightning that struck like celestial artillery. In the middle of the night, a massive pine tree, struck by a bolt of lightning, crashed down directly onto the fence of Ghost's enclosure, shearing the reinforced steel and creating a gaping hole. At dawn, the team discovered the impossible had happened. Ghost was gone. The news sent a shockwave of cold terror through the entire preserve. An apex predator, conditioned to violence and psychologically unstable, was now loose in a fragile ecosystem filled with vulnerable, disoriented animals. The potential for carnage was immense. A frantic search began, a small, highly trained team led by Aries and Leo, with Julian insisting on joining them. They were not just hunting a wolf. They were hunting a ghost, a creature whose trauma made him dangerously unpredictable. They found his tracks easily in the soft, rain-soaked earth, and their hearts sank as they saw the direction he was heading. He was moving directly toward the core territory of the bison herd. "He'll go after the calves," Leo said, his voice tense. "He's a killer, and a bison calf is an easy target." They moved as quickly as they could, their ATVs struggling through the muddy terrain, their minds filled with horrific images of what they might find. They followed the tracks to a large, open clearing near a meandering creek, and there they saw him. Ghost stood in the center of the clearing, his gray fur bristling, his body coiled like a spring, but he had not cornered a calf. He was in a tense standoff with a full-grown bull elk, one of the sick ones. The elk was in a state of delirious aggression, its antlers lowered, its eyes vacant and wild. It was pawing the ground, preparing to charge the wolf. Ghost, in turn, was snarling, his lips pulled back to reveal his formidable teeth, ready to meet the charge with a lethal response. It was a tableau of sickness and violence, a perfect storm of the two crises that had plagued the sanctuary. Before any of them could even think to intervene, a new presence entered the clearing. From the far side, Orion emerged from the tree line, his herd following at a distance. The old patriarch walked into the center of the standoff, his movements slow, deliberate, and radiating an aura of absolute, unshakable authority. He did not look at the humans. His focus was entirely on the two tormented animals. He walked directly between the enraged wolf and the sick elk, placing his massive body as a living barrier. He did not make a sound of aggression. He simply stood there, a mountain of peaceful power. Ghost, the untamable killer, froze. He looked at the massive bison, and for the first time, his snarling ceased. He seemed to recognize in Orion an alpha, presence so far beyond his own that aggression was futile. He saw a power that was not based on violence, but on pure, centered being. Slowly, respectfully, the wolf lowered his head and backed away, retreating to the edge of the forest where he sat and watched, his yellow eyes filled with a new, strange emotion, wonder. But the miracle wasn't over. The sick elk, its mind, lost to the neurological disease, was not deterred. It lowered its head and charged, its antlers aimed directly at Orion's flank. The team gasped, bracing for the violent impact. But Orion, with an agility that seemed impossible for his age and size, did not meet the charge with force. He sidestepped with the grace of a dancer, and as the elk stumbled past him, he used his massive head to give it a powerful but controlled shove. He wasn't attacking it. He was steering it. He pushed the delirious elk directly into a thick, muddy patch of blue-gray clay that bordered a natural spring at the edge of the clearing. The elk, its momentum broken, found its hooves sinking into the dense, cool mud. It struggled for a moment, and then, inexplicably, it grew calm. It lowered its head and began to lick, and then eat the mineral-rich clay. Orion had not just neutralized two threats without a single act of Violence. He had just shown them the cure. Leo was the first to understand. His mind flashed back to his toxicology lectures. The mineral deficiency, he breathed, his voice filled with awe. It's not a prion. It's not a virus. It's a neurological disorder caused by a severe, localized lack of a specific trace mineral, maybe cobalt or selenium, due to the drought. It's driving them mad with a physiological craving. That clay, it must be rich in whatever they're missing. Aris stared, her scientific mind exploding with the implications. It made perfect sense. The erratic behavior, the aggression, the disorientation, all classic signs of severe neurological imbalance from a dietary deficiency. They had been looking for a complex pathogen when the answer was literally in the earth beneath their feet. And Orion knew. He had known all along. He had been avoiding the mineral-poor grazing lands and likely leading his own herd to these hidden deposits, keeping them healthy while the other species suffered. The great bison had not just saved his own family. He had just diagnosed and prescribed the cure for the entire ecosystem. He stood over the now calm elk, a silent physician, his work done. Then he turned his great head and looked at the humans, his eyes seeming to say, "It's about time you figured it out." What does this incredible act of animal wisdom teach us? About our own approach to solving nature's most complex problems. Have we forgotten how to listen to the very creatures who understand this world best? The revelation in the clearing sent a wave of frenetic, hopeful energy through the Preserve's research team. Lab tests on the blue clay confirmed Leo's hypothesis within hours. It was extraordinarily rich in cobalt and selenium, the two trace minerals that soil samples from the 6 zones had shown to be almost completely leached away by years of drought. The mysterious plague that had threatened to destroy the preserve was a case of mass nutritional neurosis, and Orion, through his deep, instinctual knowledge of the land, had held the key all along. A massive new project began immediately. Teams fanned out across the preserve, not with tranquilizer guns, but with truckloads of the curative clay and specialized mineral blocks. They established dozens of new mineral licks in the affected areas. The effect was almost immediate. Afflicted animals, drawn by an instinct they didn't understand, flocked to the sites. Within a week, the erratic, aggressive behaviors began to subside. Within a month, the herds of deer and elk were returning to a state of health, their eyes clearing, their natural instincts restored. The silent creeping death had been halted, not by a high-tech vaccine, but by a solution as old as the earth itself. The most delicate part of the aftermath was Ghost. The encounter with Orion had fundamentally altered him. The rage was still there, a flickering ember deep in his yellow eyes, but the frantic, mindless violence was gone. He had been safely recaptured and returned to his enclosure, but his behavior was different. He was watchful, intelligent, and for the first time, he seemed capable of assessment rather than just reaction. He had witnessed a form of power that his traumatic life had never shown him. Power without violence, authority without aggression. It had broken through his conditioning. Leo, armed with the profound lesson he had learned from Orion, took over the wolf's rehabilitation. He no longer saw an irredeemable monster. He saw a broken soul who needed to be taught a new language of power. He spent months using methods inspired by Orion's calm authority, non-threatening presence, quiet respect, and an unshakable patience. Slowly, miraculously, Ghost began to respond. The wolf who had been a symbol of pure rage began to heal, his journey becoming Leo's greatest professional triumph and the subject of his doctoral thesis. The Orion Preserve's mission evolved once more. It was no longer enough to simply study animal consciousness or provide sanctuary. Their new purpose, as defined by Julian and Aris, was to study and champion the concept of indigenous animal knowledge. They began a groundbreaking new field of research, combining advanced data analysis with traditional ecological observation to learn from, rather than just about, the animals they protected. They started to see the animals not as subjects, but as experts in their own right, silent scientists who held generations of environmental wisdom in their DNA and their behaviors. Orion's fame, already considerable, ascended to a new, almost mythical level. He was no longer just the hero who had saved a boy. He was the sage who had saved an entire ecosystem. He became a living symbol of a different kind of intelligence, one that humanity, in its technological arrogance, had almost forgotten. He had proven that the most profound knowledge isn't always found in a laboratory, but sometimes in the quiet wisdom of a creature who has never left the land. As the years passed, the preserve healed and flourished, becoming more vibrant and resilient than ever. Julian, now a gray-haired philanthropist known more for his conservation work than his tech empire, found a deep, quiet fulfillment in his new life. His relationship with Leo was a source of constant joy, a partnership built on mutual respect and a shared love for the wild. Leo, now Dr. Croft, had become a leader in his field, a pioneer in the new science of animal-led environmentalism, his work with Ghost a legendary case study in trauma recovery. One cool autumn evening, 10 years after the blizzard that had started it all, Julian, Leo, and Aris stood on the high ridge overlooking the valley. They were there to say goodbye. Orion, ancient and scarred, his great body finally succumbing to the gentle weight of his years, had passed away peacefully in his sleep that morning. He lay in state in his favorite meadow, his herd standing a silent, respectful vigil around him. There were no tears, only a profound sense of gratitude that filled the twilight air. They were not mourning an ending, but honoring a life that had transformed their own in every conceivable way. As they stood there, a lone wolf howl echoed from a distant ridge. It was not a cry of sorrow, but a clear, strong song of belonging. Ghost, now the healthy, stable alpha of his own small, rescued pack in a remote corner of the preserve, was singing his own tribute. In the valley below, a young bull, one of Orion's own sons, lifted his head and answered with a deep, resonant call. It was a dialogue between two legacies, a promise that the wisdom and peace Orion had brought to the valley would endure. Julian put his arms around his son and his friend, the two people who had become his true family. He looked out at the vast, living landscape before him, a world he had once tried to erase and had instead learned to love. Orion had taught him that a legacy is not what you build, but what you protect. He had not just freed a crying bison from a cage. He had been freed by him, released from the cage of his own grief, and shown a path back to life. The bison had saved the boy, healed the father, and cured the land, his final, shocking lesson being the simplest one of all, that the deepest wisdom doesn't shout from the heavens, but whispers from the earth through the heart of a wild and noble beast. The Orion Preserve in the 2 years that followed the great bison's passing had become a global emblem of hope. It was more than a sanctuary. It was a living philosophy, a place where humanity was learning to listen to the silent, profound wisdom of the wild. The Orion Protocol, the practice of using indigenous animal knowledge to guide conservation efforts, was being studied and replicated across continents. Julian Croft, having found a purpose far greater than any corporate legacy, dedicated his days and his fortune to the flourishing of this new Eden. His bond with Leo, now a respected veterinarian and researcher on the preserve staff, was a source of quiet, constant strength, a living testament to the family that a wild creature had pieced back together. But the land, like a human soul, holds memories. And not all memories are peaceful. The first sign that the past was not truly past came subtly, a discordant note in the valley's perfect harmony. It began with the water. Dr. Aris Thorne's team, conducting routine environmental monitoring, detected a minute but persistent increase in heavy metal concentrations in the river. that flowed through the heart of the preserve. Simultaneously, a disturbing new ailment began to appear among the smaller, more sensitive aquatic species. Otters grew listless, their once playful energy fading. Beavers, the master engineers of the waterways, began to show signs of neurological distress, their intricate dam building becoming erratic and confused. The plague of the past had been a nutritional deficiency, a problem of absence. This new sickness felt different. It felt like the presence of a poison. "The models don't make sense," said Dr. Ben Carter, the preserve's senior neurologist, pointing to a complex chart on the screen. The mineral depletion that Orion diagnosed. The drought was a factor, yes, but the speed and severity of it were anomalous. It was as if something was actively stripping the soil of its vitality. And now this. These heavy metal readings are not natural. Something is leaching into our ecosystem. A new, cold dread began to seep into the sanctuary's optimistic atmosphere. They had healed the land, but they had never truly understood the origins of its sickness. The scientific team, with Leo now at its head, launched a full-scale environmental investigation. They embarked on a methodical upstream journey, taking hundreds of soil and water samples, creating a chemical map of the river's watershed as it snaked its way down from the high, remote mountains that bordered the preserve. Julian, watching the concern grow on his son's face, threw the full weight of his resources behind the search. He hired the world's best independent environmental forensics agency, a team of scientific detectives, to work alongside Aris and Leo. He felt a familiar cold fear creeping back into his heart, the fear of a powerful man facing a threat he could not control. He would not stand by and watch the paradise Orion had given them be poisoned from within. The investigation led them miles upstream, far beyond the preserve's protected borders, into the rugged, forgotten wilderness of the Black Creek Basin. And there, nestled in a high canyon, they found it, the skeletal remains of an old mining operation, long defunct, its structures slowly being reclaimed by the forest. It was a ghost of a forgotten industry, a place that hadn't seen a human footprint in decades. The source of the poison was immediately obvious. Tucked behind the main processing building, hidden from casual view, were dozens of corroded 55-gallon drums, half buried in the earth. They were leaking a viscous dark sludge into the ground, a toxic soup of industrial solvents and heavy metal byproducts that was seeping directly into the headwaters of the preserve's river. It was an environmental crime scene, a flagrant violation of every disposal law ever written. "We need to find out who owned this disaster," Aris said, her voice tight with anger as she looked at the devastation. "They need to be held responsible for the cleanup." That task fell to Julian's legal team. They began the arduous process of untangling the web of ownership for the Black Creek mine. The initial records showed it was owned by a small, regional mining company that had gone bankrupt in the late 1990s. But that company, they discovered, had been acquired by a larger conglomerate, which in turn had been absorbed by an even larger one. The lawyers followed the paper trail through a labyrinth of mergers and acquisitions that spanned 2 decades. The final report was delivered to Julian 1 week later, not by a lawyer, but by the agency's top investigator, a man who understood the gravity of what he had found. He delivered it to Julian in his study, a single sealed envelope. Julian opened it, his eyes scanning the corporate flowchart, following the lines of ownership back through time. And then he saw it. At the very top of the chain, the final holding company that had acquired all the others in a hostile takeover during the peak of his ruthless expansionary phase, was a name that made the air leave his lungs. Croft Industries. The poison that had been slowly bleeding into his sanctuary, the sickness that had nearly destroyed the ecosystem, the crisis that Orion's miraculous wisdom had averted, had all originated from a toxic wound he himself had inflicted upon the world and then forgotten. His past, The rapacious, unthinking pursuit of growth that he thought he had redeemed had risen from its shallow grave to poison his present. The irony was so profound, so devastating, it was almost biblical. He, Julian Croft, the celebrated savior of the Orion Preserve, was also its original, unwitting poisoner. He sat alone in his study for hours, the document lying on his desk like a death sentence. His entire redemption, the new life he had built, felt like an elaborate, monstrous lie. He had healed a wound of his own making, and then built a monument to himself on top of it. He thought of Orion, of the great bison's silent wisdom. And a new, more painful understanding dawned. Orion hadn't just been leading his herd to a natural antidote for a natural problem. He had been leading them to a cure for a man-made poison. The bison hadn't just been wise. He had been engaged in an act of profound, silent resistance against a world that had been corrupted by the very man who now claimed to be its protector. The hardest thing he had ever had to do was not follow a bison into a blizzard. It was walking across the lawn to the research center, the damning report in his hand, to confess to his son and to the woman who had become his closest friend. He found Leo and Aris in the main lab, poring over the latest water sample results. He laid the report on the table between them without a word. He watched their faces as they read, as their expressions shifted from confusion to dawning, sickening comprehension. The silence that followed was heavier than any he had ever known. It was Leo who spoke first, his voice quiet, stripped of all emotion. All this time, we were celebrating a miracle. But the miracle only happened because of what you did. Leo, I didn't know, Julian whispered, the words feeling hollow and inadequate even to himself. It was an asset in a portfolio, a line item I never even looked at. That man, the one who bought companies like that, he's not who I am anymore, isn't he? Leo asked, and the question hung in the air, sharp and painful. He's the one who paid for all this. The preserve, the research, this building. It was all built with the profits from places like that mine. It's all connected, Dad. There's no separating the two. Aris, her face pale, looked at Julian, her expression not of anger, but of a deep, sorrowful disappointment. The sickness wasn't the problem, Julian, she said softly. It was just a symptom. The real disease was the idea that the land was just an asset, something to be bought and sold and forgotten. And you were the one who perfected that disease. The confession shattered the peaceful world they had built. The trust between Julian and Leo, so carefully reconstructed, was now fractured. Aris's life's work at the preserve now seemed tainted, a beautiful garden grown in poisoned soil. Julian felt himself on the verge of collapsing back into the cold, empty man he had been before Orion. It would be so easy to retreat, to use his wealth to quietly, discreetly clean up the mess, to bury this truth just as the barrels had been buried. But then he thought of Orion's final heroic act. He thought of the dying bison choosing to stand, choosing to protect. He remembered the lesson that had been the foundation of his new life. True redemption wasn't about building monuments to your own change. It was about the difficult, painful work of healing the wounds you had created. He knew what he had to do. It would be the hardest, most humiliating act of his life, but it was the only way to honor the animal that had saved him twice over. He would not hide. He would confess to the world. The press conference was held on the grounds of the preserve, in the shadow of the mountains where the poison was still leaking. Julian Croft stood before the world's media, not as a celebrated philanthropist, but as a penitent. With Leo and Aris standing a few feet behind him, their presence a silent, conditional show of support, he told the entire story. He detailed his past as a ruthless corporate raider, the thoughtless acquisition of the mine, and the illegal, toxic legacy he had unknowingly inherited and profited from. He laid his past bare, accepting full and unequivocal responsibility. I stand here today as the founder of a place dedicated to listening to nature, he said, his voice steady, stripped of all artifice. "But the truth is, for most of my life I was deaf to it. The plague that nearly destroyed this valley was not a natural disaster. It was the result of a human disaster, of a greed and negligence that I was once a part of. The wisdom of the bison Orion was not just in finding a cure, but in showing us the depth of the wound we had inflicted." Then he announced his plan. He was liquidating the remainder of his personal fortune, every last stock, bond, and asset. The funds would be placed in a new, independently managed trust. Its first mandate was the complete and total restoration of the Black Creek Basin, no matter the cost. Its second mandate was to fund a new global initiative, the Foundation for Environmental Atonement, an organization that would seek out and remediate other such toxic corporate legacies around the world. "My legacy will not be the Orion Preserve," he concluded, his eyes finding Leo's in the crowd. "My legacy will be cleaning up the messes my old life created, so that there is more room in this world for places like this to exist. This is not charity, this is a debt, and I will spend the rest of my life paying it." The act of radical honesty was a thunderclap. It sent shockwaves through the corporate world and inspired a new, more demanding conversation about corporate responsibility. But for Julian, its most important effect was closer to home. As he stepped away from the podium, Leo met him. The fracture, the doubt, was gone from his son's eyes, replaced by a deep, hard-won respect. "Now I see him," Leo said quietly. "Orion, I see his lesson in you. It wasn't just about being the guardian. It was about being accountable. The cleanup of the Black Creek mine took 5 years and cost hundreds of millions of dollars. It became a global model for ecological restoration, a testament to what was possible when resources were dedicated not to profit, but to healing." Julian worked on the project tirelessly, not as a billionaire benefactor, but as a hands-on supervisor, his tailored suits replaced by muddy work boots. He was no longer one of the richest men in the world, but he had never felt wealthier. One evening years later, after the river was finally declared pure and the land was beginning to heal, Julian, Leo, and Aris stood on the ridge by Orion's grave. The setting sun bathed the valley in a clean golden light. Julian was older, his face a map of the difficult journey he had taken, but his eyes were clear and peaceful. He had confronted the ghost of who he had been, and in doing so, had become the man he was always meant to be. He realized then that Orion's final, and greatest, miracle had not been diagnosing a plague or saving a wolf. It had been showing him that the most toxic substance in any ecosystem is a truth that has been buried. A great bison had forced him to dig it all up, to expose it to the light, and only then, in that honest, painful exposure, could the real healing begin. He had not just saved the land. He had finally and completely saved Julian Croft's soul. The sun of a late summer afternoon cast a gentle, benevolent heat on the high ridge, warming the smooth, gray stone that marked Orion's final resting place. A decade had passed since the last truck had rumbled away from the fully restored Black Creek Basin, and in that time, the Orion Preserve had settled into a profound and vibrant maturity. The river below ran with a clarity that seemed to magnify the blue of the sky, and the grasslands, once scarred by poison and deficiency, now rippled in thick emerald waves under a gentle breeze. Julian Croft, now well into his 70s, stood beside the memorial, his face a roadmap of a life that had been broken, remade, and finally rendered peaceful. The sharp, predatory intensity of the billionaire was gone, replaced by the quiet, observant patience of a man who had learned to measure wealth in the health of a landscape and the strength of his bonds. Beside him stood Dr. Leo Croft, his son, now the preserve's director, and a man whose quiet authority was recognized in conservation circles around the world. And with them was Dr. Aris Thorne, her hair now a distinguished silver, her spirit as fierce and dedicated as it had been the day she'd first stepped onto this land. They were not just colleagues or family. They were the three living pillars of a legacy that had begun with a blizzard and a bison's impossible choice. "I was reviewing the latest telemetry data this morning," Leo said, his voice carrying the easy confidence of a man who was utterly at home in his purpose. "The wolf pack descended from Ghost has expanded its range into the northern territories. Their predation patterns are perfectly in sync with the elk herd's health. They're not just coexisting, they're actively making the entire ecosystem stronger. He healed, and now his children are the guardians of that healing." "Ghost learned a new language of power from Orion," Aris added, her gaze soft with memory. "And we learned a new language of science. We came here looking for data points, for predictable patterns. We thought we were the observers. But Orion, and then Ghost, and all the others, they taught us to be the students. The Orion protocol isn't about management anymore. It's about consultation. We ask the land and its inhabitants what they need, and we listen to the answer." Julian nodded, his eyes on the inscription carved into the stone. "Orion, he showed Use the way. I thought my part in this was about atonement," he said, his voice raspy with emotion. "I thought I could pour money on the wound I had made, and that would be enough. But the cleanup of Black Creek, that wasn't the payment. It was the education. I spent the first half of my life acquiring things, putting them in boxes on a balance sheet. I learned up there, with my hands in that poisoned earth, that you cannot own a river or a mountain or the life that springs from it. You can only be its steward." He looked from Aris to his son, his heart full. This preserve was born from two great secrets: the secret of the cure and the secret of the poison. Orion's wisdom revealed one, and his memory gave me the courage to reveal the other. They were two sides of the same truth. The land keeps its own accounts. It remembers every kindness and every wound. As he spoke, a small family appeared on a designated trail far below in the valley. They were beneficiaries of the foundation. For environmental atonement, a family from a small town in Ohio whose water supply had been purified in a project funded by Julian's penance. Their young daughter, no older than 10, pointed up toward a nearby hill. There, standing in silhouette against the afternoon sun, was a magnificent young bull, a direct descendant of Orion. The bull was watching them, his presence not threatening, but watchful, majestic. "It's cultural," Leo said, following his father's gaze. "We've documented it, the peace. This new generation, born on a healed land, they've learned a different way of being from their parents. The trauma is gone from the lineage. They are calm, curious, and incredibly intelligent. Orion didn't just pass on his genes. He passed on his peace." As if in confirmation, the young bull on the hill let out a low, resonant rumble. It was not a sound of sorrow or of anger. It was the deep, contented call of a being who was utterly at home, a sound of profound and abiding well-being that echoed the call Orion had made after his own healing. It was the sound of a promise kept. Julian felt the final pieces of his long journey click into place. He understood now that Orion had saved him not once, but 3 times. In the blizzard, the great bison had saved his son's life, giving him back his family. In the years that followed, he had saved Julian's soul from the sterile prison of his grief, giving him back his heart. And finally, in death, he had revealed the poison of the past, forcing Julian to confront the man he had been and giving him a chance to earn an honorable future, to save his own integrity. He reached out, placing his hand on Leo's shoulder, his eyes still on the young bull who was the living embodiment of that legacy. The journey was complete, the debts were paid. The land was pure, and the love that had been forged in a storm, tested by fire and redeemed in an act of radical honesty, would now echo through these valleys forever, carried on the wind and in the quiet, steady heartbeat of a healed and sacred world. Julian Croft was the kind of man who could buy anything except forgiveness. He thought burying Montana under glass and steel would make the pain disappear. But when his teenage son vanished into the wilderness, angry, alone, and grieving the mother they both failed to mourn, Julian realized just how useless power is when the thing you love most is lost. The blizzard was closing in, search teams were stalling, and the only lead came from something Julian had dismissed as a myth. A bison, Orion, twice the size of any man, grieving, furious, caged. Locals said his cries could break your soul. But that night, Orion did something no one expected. He escaped, not to rage, but to lead. Now the creature Julian once called a liability may be the only thing keeping his son alive. And this time, Julian has to follow him.